Reactive Training Systems.
Hey, welcome back to the Reactive Training Systems podcast. I'm Mike Tuchscherer, and today I'm doing a podcast with Coach Mel from Reactive Training Systems, who most of you will know by now. And if you don't, we did do a full interview with Coach Mel a little while back, so you can definitely go back and check that one out. We're also talking to my good friend, Jacob Tsypkin. Now, Jacob has been on the podcast many times before, but it has been a minute. So just a quick recap for people who may have forgotten or may not know who Jacob is. We go way back. He has trained and competed in powerlifting and all different kinds of martial art. He has coached powerlifters. He's coached CrossFit athletes all the way up to the CrossFit Games level. Really good coach is the thing you need to take away here. And his current focus is in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, where he himself is a black belt, and he operates a Jiu Jitsu school. Teaching skill is something very central to learning something like Jiu Jitsu. Jacob and I train together pretty frequently, and the conversation often turns to skill acquisition and the parallels between powerlifting and Jiu Jitsu or other sports. As you'll come to find out, he's more read on the body of literature around skill acquisition than I am, but both of us kind of having firsthand experience, I hope leads to some interesting conversation. And of course, Coach Mel is pretty familiar with this area as well, and she adds a lot of perspective and experience in her own right. So with the preamble out of the way, let's get right into the conversation. Here's our conversation between Coach Mel, Jacob, and I on skill acquisition. I think skill acquisition is really undervalued and
appreciated.
Yeah, and skill is important to most sports. It's also, all sports, and it's also important to powerlifting, I would say. And it's often misunderstood. Like the mean version of it, I guess, in our sport is that, to be good at powerlifting, you do sport-specific bodybuilding and technique work. I think you miss really important stuff with that, and skill acquisition is one of those things. That lifting heavy weights well is different than lifting light weights well, and you can go on and on and on. But rather than kind of rehash the fundamentals of all that, which I think most of our audience is going to be in agreement with anyway, I thought maybe a good place to start would be to, you've done a really cool job in some of our training conversations of just kind of laying out what to me is like this framework of understanding skill acquisition and kind of what current thinking is on skill development. And I think maybe that would be a good jumping off point for whatever comes next.
Sure. Preface this in two ways. First, I'll preface it by saying I'm pretty far from an expert on skill acquisition, and I'll add some context to that. So before I kind of get into how I'm thinking about it, what skill is, how skill acquisition works and all that, let me give the context of how I got to where I am, which is to say, so a little over a year ago, my jiu-jitsu coach called me up and told me he was leaving town. He's moving to Florida with his family. And he said he had somebody in mind to take over the school. And as soon as he said that, I knew who he had in mind. And here we are. And so now for a little over a year, I've been the owner and head coach of a jiu-jitsu gym. And when he asked me to step in, so I was already teaching, and I was, I've always, as long as I've practiced jiu-jitsu, I've thought about jiu-jitsu training practices. I mean, I'm a training professional. It's just going to happen. You're going to think about how to train effectively. And so at that point, a few different things were kind of going on. One was that I already had some pretty healthy skepticism about the way jiu-jitsu practice was traditionally done, which is basically the typical jiu-jitsu class. You come in, maybe you do some kind of warm-up, and the instructor has you practice a technique. And when I say practice a technique, what I mean is the instructor will walk through a sequence of steps that represent some technique, and they'll have you practice them with your partner with no resistance. Your partner is basically just a training dummy. And you would do that for some number of techniques, and then you will just do free sparring. Lots of places do a little bit more than that. Places more and more do like positional sparring, where instead of just sparring the whole game of jiu-jitsu, you train out of a particular position or whatever. But that's a really common baseline. So I was already pretty skeptical about that. And then there was around the same time, an emerging trend in jiu-jitsu, this was kind of at the very beginning of its emergence, become a lot more popular since then, led by a guy named Greg Souders. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. It might be Souders, who's a jiu-jitsu coach in Maryland. And he was basically starting to get popular, talking about not doing any of that at all, about not doing any training that doesn't have resistance. And I was already pretty amenable to that. I already had a sort of intuitive, but not necessarily reasoned skepticism about training without resistance. And then when my coach, Drew, asked me to take the school over, my sort of natural inclination was, I got to go learn about what the science has to say about skill acquisition, because that's what my job's going to be now. And so what I ended up coming to was learning a lot of stuff about what is called ecological dynamics and the ecological approach to skill. And so that's one of two big, broad schools of skill acquisition, where I would say the ecological approach is founded in ecological dynamics. And the fundamental notion is that you cannot separate the athlete from the environment. We understand the athlete as a part of the sport environment, and we understand skill as an emergent property that arises from interactions between motor control, physical action capacity, and the athlete's understanding of the task, but where that understanding, importantly, is manifested in what are called education of intention and attention. We can contrast this with the other big school, which is the information processing approach. I definitely have fewer fancy words to describe this one, but basically the information processing approach instead sort of treats skill as, it treats that intellectual portion of skill as a mental model. So it's not about the athlete's interaction with the environment. The intellectual understanding is a mental model. And this difference between the intellectual understanding being something that helps you attune more effectively to the training environment or to the sport environment versus it's a mental model has really important implications for how we train. Because if you believe that the role of the intellectual understanding, the role of the mental model, the way you use your mental models and craft your mental models has to do with better connecting the athlete to the environment, that is going to result in you sculpting that understanding in a different way than if you think the role is for the athlete to like have a more perfect model, which in and of itself affects the way they act in the environment. I guess the last thing I'll note is like one of the big core differences that's really important to understand is that these two approaches, where their differences all begin, as I understand it, is in their understanding of perception. If you take the ecological approach, you have an understanding of perception rooted in ecological psychology, which is called direct perception. You believe that we directly perceive the environment, and the sense data that we gather from the environment is sufficient for us to act. We don't need an intermediary step. There's not a mental model that we access. We just pay attention to the variables in the environment, and that is enough for us to act. Okay, so that's often referred to as the perception action cycle. If you instead think perception is indirect, which is where information processing is, it's based on the notion of indirect perception, which is rooted in cognitive psychology, then you think that the sense data in the environment is impoverished. It's not sufficient for you to know how to act. And so in between perception and action, there's a step of cognition, which is something like you have this mental model in your head. That's the purpose of the intellectual understanding. You gather the sense data, you interpret it through a process of cognition and access your mental models, and then you act. So that's kind of the core difference from which all of the other differences in both, I think, theory and application emerge.
So to give us a powerlifting example of this, if you have to back me up on some terminology here, but in an ecological approach, there's no requirement for like some mental template of what a perfect squat would look like, that you understand the task and you move your body through space.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't even know. What I don't want to do is perhaps mistakenly paint information processing as suggesting that like it thinks an ideal template is strictly necessary per se. But yeah, it's essentially, I think the ecological perspective says the environment is central. You cannot disassociate the athlete from the environment. And so what we want to do is attune the athlete to the environment. And that's really the important thing. So it's not like, oh, a squat should have these components. It's rather understand what the task is. In the case of powerlifting, it's understand the competition standards that you have to meet and train in a way, as far as skill goes, that attunes the athlete to variables in the environment. I'd be hard put to think about this. Like, I've done all of my thinking about this from a jiu-jitsu lens.
Sure.
So that's where my head's at. But essentially, it's about prioritizing the environment and tuning the athlete into the environment rather than to some abstract notion of like what their body is supposed to be doing.
I guess in the powerlifting scope and sense, to bring it to a relevant, you can talk about training in different environments and attuning yourself to working on a different barbell, a different set of plates. We know that there is a perception of the size of plates will actually affect how a lifter will interact with the barbell. That bumper plates, perception-wise, seem to be easier for athletes to lift because they perceive them as bigger. And I think this has actually been done where they changed the size and saw that athletes were better at lifting bigger plates because of the perception of them being heavier got them to react in a way that they're actually outputting more force, or they think the weight is easier or they're able to accomplish it a little bit better, despite whippiness of the bar or plates away from the center of mass, which are all variables. That is probably the most pertinent, relevant comparison I can think for powerlifting, but we really try and replicate the same environment for the competition.
Yeah, I wanted to add some detail to the idea of environment because this comes up in several different skill acquisition contexts as well. I think the most consequential thing that I think of when I think of changes to an environment that's relevant for a powerlifter is that lifting different weights even is different. You know, if you take, imagine a bench press, a scenario that people are pretty familiar with, take a bench press at 70% of your 1RM, and that's fundamentally different than a bench press at 95% of your 1RM. It's a different experience to go through that. You even see differences in activation patterns of muscles, sequences that muscles get fired in and the degree to which they get fired in. So it's a meaningful change on lots of different levels. And of course, it would changes to things like activation patterns will have a skill component. Like, it'll be relevant from a skill development standpoint. And this is one of the things I harp on quite a bit, is that technique perfected, and we can talk about what that means, if it means anything at all, but technique perfected at 70% often doesn't translate to technique at very heavy weights because of those differences. And I would say those are environmental differences.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the task has changed. The task of squatting 70% and the task of squatting 95% are not really the same. This relates to Mel and I earlier were chatting about differences in technique for like a snatch, for when the task is snatch the most weight possible versus snatch this comparatively light weight 50 times in a row in between two other exercises as fast as you can without like breaking yourself for the remainder of the event, right? You're not going to have the same technique because you're trying to solve a different problem. But to that topic of technique, it's really pretentious. It's terribly, terribly pretentious sounding, but I prefer the term that I got from Rob Gray, who hosts the Perception and Action podcast, which is probably like the central hub for this stuff, I think, in terms of popularization. It's movement solution. And it is a really pretentious sounding term when it's like out of the context of people talking about this, but I think it's really a much better way to think about it. And again, I'm biased towards a jiu-jitsu lens. And if it's not obvious already from the way I'm talking, I'm clearly biased in favor of ecological dynamics. But I think it's a much better way to talk about it. And again, so from a jiu-jitsu perspective, it really is like the problem you're trying to solve is changing every single moment that you're trying to solve it because your partner is resisting, right? This is where my natural skepticism of like, well, why are we training without resistance? And the whole thing is to be able to overcome your partner's resistance. And so what you need is not a technique. What you need is a solution. I think it's harder to tease this out with something like powerlifting because although strictly speaking, you could have the same lifter do 10 singles in the squat with 70%, so quite a lightweight, and it would look superficially like maybe they're identical, but if you peered at a small enough scale, there's going to be differences in every single rep. Every rep will be different, but those differences are much smaller than the differences you get between like any 3 exchanges between 2 of the same grapplers, even in the same scenario.
There's multiple problems to solve.
Right, and they're changing in real time. Yeah. I just want to say too, I think that environment, like the way the phrase environment is used in ecological dynamics, again, as I understand it, is very, very wide. And so skill on this approach is characterized as a relationship between the athlete and the environment. And a lot of it has to do with, I mentioned earlier this idea of educating intention and attention. So as far as the mental model goes, the purpose of the mental model, or the purpose of the intellectual understanding from an ecological point of view, is to better set the athlete's intention. So in other words, make sure that they understand very clearly what their objectives are at a variety of scales, and to educate their attention. So to get them to tune in to different information variables in the environment. One of the big differences found in research between elite and novice athletes is that elite athletes pay attention to different and more effective information variables in the environment. So that's really, really important. And again, it's tough for me to relate it to something like powerlifting, but all of these things are still at play. It's just, I think they're less obvious because it's superficially so much less complex.
Well, maybe let's narrow it down a little bit, because I think one of the ways that these topics get derailed is it seems like we're talking about technique, right? And so when people in a lifting sense think about technique, they think about 70%, and that's not really when it's important.
Right.
Think about attempting your 3rd attempt in competition, and when you walk the weight out, first of all, that can be very challenging in itself. And then you get your feet set and then realize that your stance is a little bit off. Now what? You have, albeit subtly different movement solution that you need to perform, but it's with a limit weight. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it would be ideal to not have that happen to begin with, and that's something that you can train, but these things do happen. And what I've seen is that people who are very skilled can roll with it.
Yeah.
They can deal with minor things like that, and you won't even notice. It still looks great. And they don't tend to come off the platform saying things like, oh, I just kind of lost my balance a little bit, or I didn't have my toe turned the right way. Like, those things still happen. They just compensate for it, and they may not even notice that they're compensating for it. So that's the point at which this stuff is relevant, and it's not just, focusing on minutia.
Another pretty consistent and strong research finding is that elite athletes, as compared to novices, actually have more, not less, more movement variability.
Yeah.
And I think that is, when I first learned that, it struck me as counterintuitive, because you would think, the best athletes are extremely consistent. They're consistent in terms of outcome. They achieve the outcome in spite of variability. So one of the first as researchers to look into this was a Soviet scientist named Nikolai Bernstein. I think what he's best known for is an experiment that I think has the name Bernstein's hammer, how people talk about it. Basically, he was trying to determine what the most efficient or effective way was for a blacksmith to swing a hammer. And it's pretty cool. He developed like an early version of motion capture technology. I think basically strapped a bunch of lights to blacksmiths and took these measurements. And what he found is that not only do no 2 master blacksmiths swing the hammer the same way, the same blacksmith swings the hammer differently every single time. And they achieve the outcome nonetheless. As I understand it, a big part of this is essentially because every time you swing the hammer, you are managing all these different degrees of movement, from your feet to your shoulders, and your elbows and wrists and hands. And the real, it's essentially virtually impossible to just do it the same way every time. So the real skill is adjusting in real time to these changing variables and getting the same outcome. Bernstein termed this repetition without repetition. And it's interesting because, I think what one could say as regards powerlifting is, you might look like you're doing the same thing every time, but in reality, every single rep in a set of 5, you're practicing your ability to execute repetition without repetition. because even if the squat looks visually the same, it looks the same because you are overcoming all these different variables in the environment every single time and managing to achieve the same outcome. So it's like, it's not that you are, I think that with the information processing approach, there's a notion of how motor control works that is called the general motor program. And the idea is, essentially like you're a computer. I'm sure I'm, under nuancing that, but essentially that there's this general motor program that you train into your system, and there's, the little homunculus in your brain executes the program and says, do squat program. And because you have that program really refined, you do it the same way every time. Whereas I think the ecological approach would say, there's no program. You just have an intention. You're trying to perform a certain task, and you start the task and you manage all the variables in the task in real time, reacting to the environment as you go. So to go back to the point of like different plates maybe feeling different, right? There's this concept called haptic feedback. Haptic feedback is literally like the physical, it's the feedback that you feel. Obviously, this is super important in grappling, right? I'm sure there's plenty of people who listen who have done some amount of grappling. If you've trained with someone who's really, really good, you'll notice that they have what seems to be like incredible timing. And most of what is happening is just they can feel what's happening at a level that you can't, right? Or if you yourself are a really accomplished grappler, you know that like what seemed like magic or seemed like magic when you were new now is just like you just feel a person move in a direction and you can exploit that movement, right? This is haptic feedback. And so if you have take like really thin calibrated plates on a very, very stiff bar compared to maybe big bumper plates on like a kind of crappy, Globo Gym bar, you are going to have different haptic feedback. It's going to be different. It might not look different visually, but it's going to feel different. And to your point, Mike, elite athletes are going to be better at overcoming those differences. They're going to have more adaptability in their technique.
Something that also just cued is that, for every training session, you're not really the same athlete every single time. Like you could have had a few bad nights of sleep. Maybe your recovery is a little bit under or over, but there's probably still enough of you recovered enough to compensate for, say, it's not like you do a hard lower body training session and 3 days later, every single muscle group has recovered exactly 75%. Mm-hmm. There's going to be deviations on what muscle group really can show up to a workout each time. And you probably aren't even aware, but you'll be able to achieve the outcome based on your current status because of all those small compensations. I'm sure if you hooked up an EMG and measured entire blocks, same workout, there is going to be differences, and you will be practiced enough that the squat, the bench, the deadlift might look the same, but those small nuances of even going to a session feeling a little bit sore are easily overcome by an athlete who is accustomed to accomplishing the task.
Right. So what do we do about it? I guess is the next thing. If that's correct, what meaningful changes does that make to the way somebody prepares for sport? So maybe a good place to start would be what changed in your jiu-jitsu practice after thinking about this.
Sure. So again, we followed more or less the common model with some deviation, just because like I was always fairly creative, just because again I think about training a lot. But so to reiterate, essentially what that looked like is when I would teach a class, and when my coach would teach a class, anybody at the school would teach a class, we would start by setting some topic area. Usually the way it worked is for a month at a time, we would pick a position. So let's say it's the mount. And then you would teach some technique from the mount, and you would practice that with no resistance. Or maybe we'd say like, the phrase I sometimes would use was, give your partner, do a couple reps with zero resistance, and then just enough resistance for your partner to feel the physics, right? And you would practice that. And then what you would do is you do that 2 or 3 times, usually with related techniques, right? So we'll do this first technique, and here's a really common defense to that technique. And here's the technique you do when your partner defends in that way, et cetera, et cetera. We do that for a few rounds, and then we would do some live training out of that position. So we just do what's called positional training from mount. Okay, we've practiced our techniques from mount, and now the idea is start from the mount and train until either the top player submits the bottom player or takes their back or whatever the win condition is, or the bottom player escapes. That's fairly common. That's called positional training. And I think at least in the jiu-jitsu space, what a lot of people, they look at the ecological approach and they say like, this is just positional training. This is just a variation on that. And that's not untrue. Positional training fits under the ecological approach. The ecological approach is a big umbrella. So what changed? What changed is I started thinking about jiu-jitsu, not in terms of techniques, but in terms of concrete physical effects. What is the effect I'm trying to have on my partner's body, right? So a lot of this I borrowed from Greg Suter. Some of it I've kind of like massaged into my own form, but essentially started thinking about things like, number one is connection. All grappling starts with connection. What are the various kinds of connections we can make to our partner? What are we trying to do with those connections, right? So we come up with this model. Again, a lot of this is from Greg. We can just say it's his model. It's easier that way. But essentially, all of grappling can be thought of as an immobilization game. You're trying to gradually take away more and more of your partner's ability to move until you can isolate a limb. You're attacking the periphery of the body, so their hands, wrists, elbows, ankles, knees, to gain control of center mass, the hips and the shoulders, and then isolate and attack a limb. So I started thinking in these really concrete physical ways rather than like, oh, I'm trying to pass the guard. Instead of thinking of pass the guard, it's get past their feet, get past their knees, get my chest on their torso. And so then what I started doing was, instead of practicing techniques, I would just design games where they would have a live practice task with specific constraints. And so this is where we can kind of get into the main manifestation of the ecological approach in training, is what's called the constraints-led approach or constraints-led training. And that's basically the idea that you, rather than telling the athlete how to accomplish something, you give them an objective and you have them perform a practice task in which they try to achieve that objective. And then you apply constraints, where constraints can be anything. Constraints can be the most obvious things, like these are the rules you have to follow. But constraints can also be like, if I tell you, hey, I really want you to pay attention to where your partner's hands are. If your partner's hands are down low, try to get grips with your thumbs down. If your partner's hands are up high, grip thumbs up, or something like that. That can be a constraint, just the way we focus our intent. So everything's a constraint. And so what we started doing was just playing these games, these practice tasks that were live and resisted. And that's almost all that we do now. We will still do a little bit of like technique drilling, quote unquote, but I actually use a different word for it. We call it landmarking. And I understand the purpose very differently. Where I used to think doing that kind of those dead reps, those static reps, the purpose was to build skill. Now I understand it as I'm using this as a tool to focus people's attention on something, to point out to them that if they do these things, it'll help them achieve the task objective. And so we play these various tasks. We play them at a lot of different scales. So the tasks can be very big, broad scale. Pass the guard, get past their feet, get past their knees, get your chest and their torso. Or the task could be something at a very small scale. So in the case of passing the guard, we might do something like, hey, just keep their feet off of you. The bottom player, their objective is to put their feet on you. That's how they play guard. Your job is just to keep their feet off you. And that forms about 90% of what we do now. So we just sort of break the game down into like, what are the concrete physical effects you're trying to have on your partner's body, and how can I design practice tasks which are constrained, whether by rules or by drawing attention or however I can think of to do it, which will get the athletes to find solutions for the objective, find their own way to do it. Now, of course, a lot of the time, similar solutions emerge, right? But that's the kind of powerful thing about it, is I don't have to teach them a knee cut pass for them to learn a knee cut pass. And I would even say me teaching them a knee cut pass and them learning a knee cut pass are not the same thing. So the mental shift I've undergone is my job is not teaching jiu-jitsu. My job is facilitating learning of jiu-jitsu. Not the same thing. That's the big change. I'm not totally sure how to think about translating that to powerlifting, just because like
There's a huge translation, I think.
sure, what's the I don't know what the non-live resistance is in powerlifting. So
We use accessories all the time to constrain. Like, if I want an athlete to practice tension, I'm going to make it very hard to accomplish the task unless you've built up tension. Like, if you have a tempo, if you have them tempo to the knee, it's going to be very hard for them to move more weight, which they always want to do, without establishing a good starting position and getting that tightness that they might not intuitively be doing. Or if you want to work with bar path, using a pin to exacerbate the punishment for incorrect movement lines. And it might not be the one that you would expect happen, but they will solve a pattern in a way that they are going to leverage where they think is strongest in order to accomplish the outcome. We all want to add weight to the bar.
yeah. Weightlifting is, I mean, obviously weightlifting training is very much the same way, right? Like if I have an athlete who consistently under pulls, well, and like the way that they perform their clean is they pull themselves way under the bar and like it crashes on them, but they don't pull it as high as they could. And we might assign power clean. We might say, now you can't, we're going to constrain the task, right? Such that you can't rely on that same movement solution. I guess the way that I'm thinking about it is, what's the powerlifting equivalent of static drilling? Because to me, it's like, is it just saying like, I'm going to take 60% and do a bunch of light work? Is that the equivalent of drilling with drilling with no resistance for powerlifting?
I mean, I do see a lot of that. And I see lots of training at what seems to me to be fairly absurdly low RPEs. And I start to think like, what do we hope to accomplish from doing that? Like if you're doing, sets of 70% for, 3, 4, 5 reps, I mean, you could make the case, maybe your intention is to develop early rate of force development, you're working on explosiveness or something like that, in like a more of a traditional speed work capacity. We could talk about the utility of that. Like, okay, but outside of that, what I see in programs is without any special behind the protocol, it's just like you're accumulating volume, and it's not that there's no effect for it, but I do think that there's probably better ways to spend your time,
Sorry to be the Canadian and the Americans, but it reminds me of, there was like a football player who got a lot of practice throwing bricks to his dad, like very intentionally being present for every single movement. And I think the risk of the low RPE work is the athlete actually present in those reps where they're going to be able to translate that to the 1 rep max. Or are they just accumulating volume, going through motion that's not practicing?
There was a story about a powerlifting coach. Let me start off by saying this could be totally be me just being overly apologetic. But there was a powerlifting coach who I know his training philosophy really emphasizes skill development, practice, high frequency of practice. And there was this photo of him training one of his athletes doing squats standing on Bosu balls, and I mean, that's a huge no-no in the powerlifting world, right? And so everybody's like, what in the world? Like, come on, like surely this guy's a joke, right? But me being me, I'm thinking, well, if you truly believe that high frequency practice is super important, like he does, then you can't always train heavy, hard, 6-7 days a week. Some of those sessions need to be light sessions, and they would be like 40% of 1RM. So how do you keep the athlete present and engaged with 40% of 1RM? They're going to come in there and just like do their things, they do their reps and off they go. Right. Yeah. It's easy to do those in a mindless way. So don't stand on Bosu balls. And now you have to pay attention to what you're doing. And I'm not saying that that's a great way to train, but like I said, maybe I'm just being overly apologetic.
Well, like a lot of times if you win the mental battle with athletes, if you make them engaged and have intent with the reps, you help them win the session.
Sure.
I think it's just a few distinctions sort of worth making here. One is, well, this is not a distinction per se, but just something that I've thought about in regard to this is that, so in the ecological approach, people sometimes talk about action capacity. Action capacity is sort of a way of talking about your physical capacity to actually execute what is required of you. And it's also important that like your action capacity widens the field of affordances. So the opportunities, the idea of affordances is essentially that when you look around at the environment, the environment you're engaged in a kind of a sporting task, certain things are going to stand out to you as opportunities for action, and your physical preparation is going to impact that. So in other words, a really good example is like you just pretty much intrinsically know, if you look at a gap, I can easily jump across that, or that would be a hard jump, but I could do it, or I might just make that, or there's no way I can make that, right? That's your perception of affordances. In grappling, we might talk about like we see something that's having graspability or penetratability. I might see the gap between somebody's elbow and their ribs and say, oh, that's underhookable, right? Mm-hmm. Rob Gray, of that podcast, likes to talk about cats see every flat surface as having nap ability or lay down ability, right? And so when you have more action capacity, when you're fitter for your sport, you're going to see more affordances. You will literally pick out more opportunities. And the reason I bring that up is that action capacity obviously is developed by sport practice, but typically when we talk about a sport like jiu-jitsu, we also talk about doing strength and conditioning. And the idea being that strength and conditioning is the thing that increases, or it's a major way to increase your action capacity. Yeah. When we talk about something like powerlifting, it's sort of like the sport training is the action capacity training, but then again, not really. So this is where the distinction comes in, that we might want to draw a line between, it is hard in my head to apply this stuff as directly to something like powerlifting, that the raw, like what I think of as a performance sport rather than a game sport, because there is so much of getting better at powerlifting, not all of it by any means, but a lot of it is like raw physiological stuff. You have to make your muscles bigger. You have to make your tendons stiffer. And then there's that upper limit, and it's typically referred to as peaking, which is like enhancing your ability to work at the limit. And so I think that in research, it seems to be that like with regards to just strength development, not peaking, not maximal strength, not like the ability to move the absolute most weight under competition conditions, but general strength, there's not much of a difference that shows up between like RPEs 6 and 9. Like as long as the weights are sufficiently heavy, you can drive strength. So maybe what that should suggest to us is to think about are ways of training for powerlifting that are appropriate for developing action capacity. And there are ways of training for powerlifting that are appropriate for developing sporting skill. And those are two different things. And of course, a lot of people already think like this, right? Because we talk about hypertrophy blocks and strength blocks and peaking blocks, or however you want to frame it. And that's kind of the same thing. But in order to relate it to this, like this ecological idea of skill, that is what makes sense to me, is to say like, well, we have ways we train. What we're trying to do is hone in on that sport performance skill. And we have ways we train where we're trying to sort of develop the pure physiological stuff. Of course, it's all happening at once in reality. But I think then the question becomes how, not even how much, but like how do we determine how much of the sporting skill to do versus how much of the action capacity to do? How do we periodize those things, right? Obviously, there's people who, I mean, you could basically say the conjugate approach to say you train all those things all the time. And there's much more linear approaches where you have blocks of training those things. But I do think there's that, like, that's where the divide is. There's a point at which we're training, or maybe what I should say is the mistake in jiu-jitsu, in my opinion, is to think we do static drilling to develop skill. I might do a little static drilling, but the point's not to develop skill. Well, the point of working with low loads or low RPEs is not really to develop your technique. There might be a reason to do it, but we shouldn't think that it develops the technique you're going to have with 95%.
Well, and that can at times come across as like splitting hairs or arguing semantics, but I really think it's not. Knowing that, doing these low effort squats is not really going to meaningfully improve your technique at high loads, that will change your decision making.
It'll substantively change the way you train, for sure.
And you may still have a reason for including it, and that's fine. And the reason doesn't have to be some really brainy sounding reason either. Like it could just be like, I do this and my squat gets better. I'm fine with that.
Totally.
But on the long term, having a good rationale for like why we're doing this stuff, it makes a difference. And it's important for problem solving, which is most of what writing training programs and most of coaching, I think, is problem solving to different degrees. But one of the things that we talk about is whether or not it's important to have this mental model of what perfect technique or an idealized technical model is. I think maybe that should be a thing that we could spend a little time on as well. Whether or not is that a thing that's worth doing.
Do you want to start, Mel?
Sure. So, like for instance, when I teach people, novices, the first time to lift and how to lift the squat, bench, deadlift, I typically give them the outcome. I'll just mention squat. I will say that to a group of people who may have varying abilities and varying familiarity with exercise, I will tell them to try and get their hips below parallel and stay upright and move their feet in a way they feel solid and stable. And you'll have the variety of people who will look down at their feet and want you to provide the exact distance their feet should be, or have heard that your feet should be narrow and their knees need to go right over their toes. And instead of trying to solve where they think they are the strongest, they will search and reach for the answer of what is the correct thing to do, the ideal technique. I'll give you this one. And the ideal technique is this thing they should aim for. And once they hit it, it will be perfect. We'll replicate it every single time, winning squat. But if I just give them the outcome, if I just tell them what parameters to hit, they will typically intuitively align themselves into a pretty natural solution that will typically be in their benefit to develop. They'll self-align themselves into where they think is strongest. And in their exploration of different stances, they'll start to feel what doesn't feel good. And they'll almost solidify their confidence in their own technique if given the opportunity to develop it. So in the search for ideal technique, giving them more of an opportunity to explore and figure out what that feels like works better in that coaching and instruction than telling them to aim for certain movement patterns that I'm looking for that will check those boxes.
So make sure I'm understanding correctly, there's certain landmarks that you would say are fairly universal, and then other qualities that vary from person to person and rep to rep even. So would those landmarks that are more or less unchanging, is that the model for perfect technique?
I would say some of them exist. Like you want a squat to typically be balanced on the foot, like a landmark, like you would want to identify that that's not going to set you up for success in the future. You typically want going down in a squat, the knees to somewhat trap over the toes, but let the athlete figure that out, because you will always have outliers. And you want to give those outliers a chance to present themselves and not rob them of success.
What I'd say is there's no ideal technique, and it's unhelpful to think in those terms. But there is a concept we can use to kind of talk about the things you guys are both circling around, and that concept is invariance. There are certain things inhere in a task, that inhere in the nature of the task, that are invariant. And usually invariances come down to physics. So to use the squat as an example, there's a lot of things people can do differently and have an effective squat. What you will never see is someone squatting really, truly maximal limit weight for their strength with their heels completely off the floor, standing up on the balls of their feet, right? So we need flat feet for efficient force transference, or essentially flat feet. What else? Balance, as you said. You need to have enough balance across your foot that you're not tipping forward, backward, side to side. These are invariants, right? There's no ideal technique, but there is the laws of physics. And so what I'll typically do if I'm coaching somebody totally new on a squat, what I'll actually tell them for their first squat ever is just do a squat. I want you to squat down. And they'll do it. And sometimes a very common thing is their heels are too far off the floor. They're up on their toes. So what I tell them is, I'd like you to keep your feet flat. Can you adjust the position of your feet so that you can keep them flat? And what do they all do? They all widen their stance, right? And so I think kind of to go along with what Mel was saying, I don't know what I would even gain out of an idealization of technique other than giving the athlete something to strive for that's actually not relevant. What's actually relevant is whether they can accomplish the task, where maybe the task is a maximal squat to powerlifting standards. Maybe the task is squatting in a way that really exposes your quads or your glutes to the load, depending on what you're trying to do. And giving them clues that help them explore and figure out their technique. And we can aid those clues with the understanding of invariance, which is, pretty much the laws of physics. All of my clients at this point just know, if I'm doing any movement that looks at all like a squat, if I'm doing a back squat, a front squat, a leg press, a hack squat, a belt squat, my feet need to be flat. I need to be able to go as low as is required of me based on whatever standard we're using. I need to be able to keep my back basically straight. And as long as I'm doing those things, I'm meeting the requirements. And their job is to figure out how to adjust their body to do that. At no point in that process do I need to refer to an idealized model of technique that doesn't actually apply to any human on the planet. It only applies to an abstraction.
When you're coaching jiu-jitsu and you're coaching someone who, let's say, is very skilled, do you find that the technique, like more of the details matter? Like, I don't know, like some minutia that maybe you overlook for beginners or something like that. Someone's just learning a technique, but I don't even know what it would be. But
I totally understand. Yeah. I wouldn't. So I would, yes. And I wouldn't say if the details matter more. The details always matter a lot. But the more advanced you are, the more experience you have, the more capacity you have to actually apply your understanding of those details. So the way that I sometimes think about skill development is like when you first learn jiu-jitsu, you're learning the outlines. So in our foundations program for new students, it's a 12-week program. The whole point is all we're trying to get them to do is understand what are you trying to do in the game of jiu-jitsu, right? Basketball, very intuitive. You don't have to know anything about basketball. You can watch a game for 5 minutes and understand, these people are trying to take the ball to that side of the court and put it in the hoop. Jiu-jitsu is not like that. You like the submission part is obvious enough, but like you have to get people to understand what they're trying. I'm sure I'm under nuancing basketball. Don't at me, basketball players. But what we try to do in that program is just get them to understand, look, when they're on their back and you're standing up, the whole thing you're trying to do is get past their legs. They're trying to keep their legs in front of you and you're trying to get past their legs. And that's all the level of detail we'll give them. Why? It's not because the details, the specifics of how they do it matter any less. It's because as new learners, they're not in a place to apply more detail. We just want to get them to play the game and to try to figure it out. More advanced students who have been working on the process of getting past the legs for 2, 3, 5, 10 years, they're attuned to that environment. They're attuned to that task much more effectively. They have a clear set of intentions. They understand exactly what they're trying to do, and they're tuned into more effective variables. And so for somebody like that, like you can show me a detail in passing the guard and I can employ it right away. I'm not an especially good jiu-jitsu player. I'm like dead average if I could guess.
So is the black belt. Okay.
Well, I'm average among black belts. I'm average, like honestly, I'm better than most blue belts. But like I watched some guard pass that I just saw a quick clip of on Instagram the other day, and I went in and I hit it like 6 times that night. It's not because I'm so good at jiu-jitsu. It's because I have this like deep well of experience. I'm really well attuned to the environment. And so you can just like show me these little details and I can make them work. So it's not that the details matter more for a more advanced player. It's that the more advanced player is in a place to better understand and apply those small details.
I guess that it's that the details, the thing, like perfecting the details or improving your exploitation of the details
kind of
is where you make progress at that point.
Kind of, but like I kind of hesitate to even say the details because I shrink away. Even when we say the details, it gives the impression that like, so I'm gonna name like a technique that I think will be the most easily accessible to people. It's not one that I'm like an expert in because I'm not a wrestler, but we'll talk about the double leg takedown. The double leg takedown, I think most people, even if you've never grappled, it's basically a fancy tackle. You're tackling somebody. So I don't want to give the impression, if I say the details of the double leg takedown, the details become more important. That still sort of gives the impression that there's a correct way to do a double leg takedown. And it's just that when you're new, we don't expect you to get all the details right. And as you get better, you're going to get all the details right. Instead, it's that there's actually a bunch of different ways to perform a really effective double leg takedown. And as you get more and more advanced, I think you understand the fundamental, or you should, hopefully our coaching process and our learning process gets you to understand, have an applied understanding of what makes a double leg takedown work, such that when I show you some quote unquote detail, some little thing you can change, it'll make you more effective, you can actually apply it. But yeah, I don't even want to put it like the details because there's not one way. There's not the way to do a double leg takedown. More advanced students are going to be in a better position to try any number of different things that might make it work.
I almost want to call it like the delay of like when trying a solution, you tell someone who's newer, they have to think and then almost gather the proprioception, then execute. While more advanced athletes in almost any sport, there's less of a buffer or a ping or a delay in them applying a solution because they're now so familiar with the outcome that they will self-align and it'll almost become instinctual. Instead of flinching or pausing, they align themselves in a better, like how you're able to replicate things quite quickly. Wanted to loop back into something that's common in powerlifting that has to do with movement solution patterns, and that is the rounded back deadlift, in where some people's movement solution pattern involves a very rounded back solution, and the call of which, in your opinion, in your sport, if you've ever seen someone repeatedly do a movement solution pattern that you're like, that is hindering your success. And it's almost like it's so ingrained that you have to take a step back and do a lot more restrictions to try and change that flinch, change that instinct. How would you do that in your sport? I know it's one thing, and we're going back to ideal technique, but there are some lifters that you almost want to.
I mean, as it applies to power, especially, maybe that's all the further I'm willing to go at this point. There may not be, I mean, we can talk about like ideal technique, not ideal technique, but we would all agree that there's just some basic requirements that have to be met. And that seems to be, and then going beyond that seems to be things, my instinct is to call them details, but if we don't like that, then there are other things that are not core to the basic execution of the movement or the solution. Are situationally helpful, let's say.
So I guess what I would say, there's a couple things to kind of respond to both of you. One is, I think that at least on the ecological approach, we would just say that the thing, it sounds like, Mel, with what you're describing is almost more like the information processing understanding, where essentially the new athlete, their mental model is not very well built yet, and it's not very robust, and they're not accessing it quickly. And what's happening with the more advanced athletes is that they have a better, more robust, more fleshed out, more quickly accessible mental model. And so I don't think I would want to, because I'm kind of taking the stance of the ecological approach here, I don't think I would want to put it that way. But it's rather that, like, the more advanced athlete is very well attuned to the environment. So one thing you consistently hear from athletes, and there's some research that suggests this is a real thing that happens, is to get back to the concept of affordances. Your level of like skill and preparation for a task will change the way you pursue. So I'm not going to name names, I don't remember them, but there's like famous quotes. There's a tennis player who talks about, like, when you're on, the ball just looks as big as a grapefruit. And a famous basketball player said, when you're on, it's like throwing pebbles in the ocean. Like the basket just looks bigger to you, right? You'll hear baseball batters talk about, like, the ball just seems like it's coming to you more slowly. And what I think, quote unquote, the ecological dynamics approach thinks is going on there is that really good athletes are so well attuned to the environment that they are actually, like, perceiving it in a more effective way. Maybe it's slower, maybe the target looks bigger. And as a result of that, when you give a more advanced athlete, maybe the word we want is not details, it's like options, right? When you give a more advanced athlete those options, they are so well connected to the environment that they can just, like, make those things work right away. But it's not because they do or don't have to think about it necessarily. It's because, I don't want to use the word autopilot. They have certain stuff on, like, autopilot. They're not so caught up in the whole big task. Like, when I'm passing somebody's guard, I don't really have to think, unless they're very, very good, or at least as good as I am, that I don't have to think about holding them down. I'm just like, I'm on top and I'm doing all this stuff. My body is doing all this stuff that I'm not focused on at all, just to keep you on your back. But when we do guard passing with brand new people, I have to constantly remind them, keep them on their back. They want to get off their back. Don't let them, right? And so I think, like, for me, the way that I think about it is, when you give me that guard pass I was playing with the other night, that movement solution, actually, if it was somebody with much less experience, if I got them focusing on the variables I focused on, which would, like, find a post in their near armpit and their far knee, and then back step out. For somebody who's new, they might do that and their partner would just be like, I'm going to stand up now. because you weren't doing the things you needed to be doing to hold me down on the ground.
You weren't focused on the core
principle of executing.
yeah.
Right. And like, I don't need to be focused on that. It's just happening because I'm like, and again, I really dislike the term autopilot, that none of it's automatic. We're not machine, but I think that is more what's going on than like that you just have this mental model that you're better at accessing, which I'm not sure if that's what you were alluding to, but that's kind of how it came across to me. And yeah, Mike, I would just say it's not details per se, it's options. There's more choices, there's more ways. But again, I guess let me bring back the concept of invariance. I do think in jiu-jitsu, there's certain engagements and situations which are high variability, passing the guard, taking somebody down, chaotic. There's others in which there's relatively little variability. Like if you have somebody in an armbar, there's only one way to break somebody's arm in an armbar. You extend their elbow too far. And if I'm teaching armbars, or if we're working on armbars, I think there's a lot more room for like a little more direct, technical, prescriptive advice, because the elbow breaks one way, it's by hyperextending, or if you're in a different situation, by twisting too far, right? I would think that in powerlifting, everything we do in powerlifting is much more on that side of the variability spectrum, where like the degree of variability in a squat is much more similar, and I would say even less than the degree of variability in an armbar than it is like the degree of variability in guard passing. And we should probably think about training things with radically different degrees of variance a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think where I see the most variance come into play is between individuals,
for sure.
But I guess where I'm trying to get to is like, what do I do differently, like based on like what would each of these ideas, these camps around skill acquisition, have me do differently when it comes to my own training? I mean, I think one thing that we touched on would be keeping, if I'm trying to develop the skill of lifting a maximum weight, that I have to lift a weight that's relevantly challenging,
right?
That if it's too easy, and that changes based on your skill level. Again, if you're more novice, then just doing bodyweight squats or something very light can present a sufficient technical challenge that even just doing that helps you improve and improve your skills. Once you're well trained, it takes more further repetitions at 70% to no longer provide that stimulus, And I'm even a bit skeptical that things like slowing the tempo it's conditional, that if there's a specific deficiency that we're trying to help, that applying that type of constraint, a tempo constraint, can be helpful in highlighting it, but you still have to present it with a sufficient intensity that it's a challenge, right? So to give an example, let's use the round back deadlift. You have somebody who's rounding in the deadlift, and for whatever reason you want to change that, and you're trying to develop them out of that, you may have them do pause deadlifts. Well, if the pause deadlift is sufficiently light, that's also not very challenging. So, it still has to present a challenge. It's just that constraint gives you, more training options to present that challenge to people. But outside of that, I'm trying to think of why would I not have at least a broad model of what would constitute an ideal technique? And what I could hear, some objections that I can anticipate would be, well, I have a broad model of technique. I cover some of those basics, and that gives me enough flexibility to change the details to suit an individual presentation. So this is what, the idealized version of a squat. But if somebody, shows that they're more comfortable or stronger or whatever with a slightly wider stance or a higher bar position or something, then I can, update my model to fit that.
My question would be, how do you derive the idealized model in the first place? Right? What would you do to derive that? It seems to me the only reasonable way to derive the model would be to defer to the laws of physics. Right, exactly. When you do that, my suspicion is that what you're going to find is that, oh, there's actually a ton of variables that are inherently related to the individual. And so, sure, you can have that model. My guess is that the model is going to be so sparse that because like you just can't say, you cannot put it, in my opinion, you're not going to be able to say in your model what's the ideal bar position on the back. For who? For a person who's 6'6", 6 foot, 5'6", for a person who weighs how much, for a person with what limb lengths and torso length. So like, oh, just can't put that in the model because I can't reduce, like you have to reduce to just the level of like the most basic physics. And then sure, you can have that model, but to me, it's like, what good is this model, right? Other than understanding like, yeah, I need to have flat feet and I need to be, my joints need to be basically stacked. Wait, like what is that? What does it do? So it's not that I would say what's wrong with having it. What I would ask is, what does it do for you?
Yeah. So one thing I've picked up from listening to you is that the focus for you is on like problem solving. So you notice then that somebody is doing something, their center of balance, they're having trouble maintaining balance when they're doing a squat, and you say, well, what I see just as a coach is that maybe your bar position is really low and that's making the balance difficult. Let's try a higher bar position and that makes it easier. Yeah, I'm trying to understand that. And
I guess the search for the ideal technique is what you're saying, like the physics and lever stacking. And with genetics, there is like thousands of different ways someone's genetics can predispose their connections for muscles, where their limbs in the socket, but if we're using the squat a lot. I guess for idealized techniques, say you have a very long femur lifter who is going to present some difficulty in work them against the technique rather than them against the weight. So we want to try and manifest their squat in a way that makes it so physics is as least of a barrier for them as possible. We want to try and likely go towards widening their stance so their hip bone can sit lower in the socket so they can achieve below parallel easier. The bar path being lower is likely to help them maintain that bar position better over midfoot. Mm-hmm. So I do like the idea of physics and lever stacking, looking at the individual levers the person presents and stacking up physics in a way that allow them to use what they have to move the most amount of weight.
Right.
Within certain parameters that we want knees to generally track or technique to be safe and preventative of injury, which is...
Well, even, that's a whole different topic, but I'm so like... I think that most injury is the result of poor load management, not like, I think you have to do some wild stuff with technique for the technique to actually be the issue in and of itself. I think it usually has to do with like getting into positions that you're not adapted to. But I do think there's efficiency. Like there are things that you're going to do that are just going to be relatively inefficient. And yeah, so I just don't, to come back to the idealized model, it's not that like, oh, it's wrong to have one. It's just my instinct is to say it's going to be so sparse that I don't know what it does for you. And yeah, absolutely. When I think about coaching, I think about problem solving. Like my job is to get the athlete to perform the task. So all of my tools are oriented in that way. It doesn't, if having an idealized model of the squat, if I had some reason right now to think, this is a tool I can use to make my athletes, my clients better at squatting, then I'd be fine with that. I don't even know how would you use that model, I guess,
I think the way that people think that they use that model is, like I said, I have this picture in my head of what an ideal squat looks like. So when somebody comes in, I want their squat to look like that. It presents certain problems, and then we deviate from that model to find whatever their perfect technique is.
Yeah.
And from where I sit, maybe it doesn't, I think it can have some implications in how you select certain training protocols. It's not going to lead to like vastly different approaches or something that's like just that we've never seen before in terms of training program development. I guess how you think about the development of certain training tasks, training interventions. So we categorize exercises for powerlifting. We use the Bondarchuk classification, and initial disclaimer of all classifications being
Imaginary.
Yeah, and imperfect.
All models are wrong. Some are useful.
Yeah, that whole idea. But we start with competition exercise, which is probably the most intuitive one and most self-explanatory one. What we would call development exercises tend to be intended more on this, let me give you some constraint to help you develop your skill in the competition lift in some way that I feel is relevant. And then preparatory exercises tend to be more developing you, to use the term you used earlier, like improving the number of affordances that you have,
Building action capacity.
Yeah, action capacity, sorry. Building action capacity. So when it comes to those developmental exercises in particular, the way that we're thinking about it is you do X in the competition lift. I want you to do Y instead. So I'm going to give you a task that helps you feel that thing and practice. I mean, maybe that's too internal.
Maybe it's something like, I'm going to give you a task which constrains you in such a way that you cannot do the thing that I don't want you to do. That's going to require you to do. Right.
That's usually how it shows up for us is like this reward punishment thing. Because we're not, most of the time, it's not, we can't limit it so much that you just simply can't.
Right.
The one that comes to mind is like squats are a good one. If you dump forward on a front squat, you just lose the bar, which is one of the reasons I think it's a really good tool for teaching that quality, right? How we think about those things and how I hear you talking about those is maybe a little bit different than the way that we would normally talk about them. Maybe I'm wrong on that as well.
Are you talking about like in terms of training modalities, in terms of how you choose what to do in training?
Yeah. So like when you're developing a drill, the kinds of things that the ways that you focus an athlete's attention or the ways that you provide those constraints. And
we for success in the outcome that you want for successful expression of the skill or detraining of the skill you don't want to see.
To give an example, it seems to me that there are significant degrees of freedom there, that it's this presentation of a task and they can just do the task and the task does the teaching more or less. And then it minimizes the requirement of being like, well, don't turn your knee like this, turn your knee like that instead.
Yeah, so I would even say it's not that the task does the teaching, it's that the task enables the student to do the learning, right? It's really, I think it's really critical to make this distinction between like my goal is to make myself redundant on the mat, right? My goal is to just like the students are there to learn and I'm there to facilitate that. So there's a couple things to say. One, first of all, and I'll relate this, if you're a jiu-jitsu person out there following the hot eco versus old school training approach, I think that one common misconception is that like, oh, the ecological approach means you can't do X, where X is usually static drilling. I think it's really important to understand you can do anything. You can do whatever you want, even and still be, like ecologically sound or however you want to think about that. I think the key is in understanding what is the intent of the practice task that you're designing. And so, like I said, and I think maybe among people who are like pretty hardcore, I guess, eco advocates, I'm not unique by any means, but maybe a little bit different in that we still do some amount of what people think of as static drilling. But again, the understanding of why, the intent is different. What we never do is like, take 5 minutes and I want you and your partner each to do like 20 reps of this technique. Instead, what we do is we call it landmarking. We'll usually do a practice task first, then I'll say, hey, now here's a potential solution to that task. I'll very rarely go into small details, and instead I'll say like the things that make this work are, you get to use the knee cut pass for whatever reason. It's my favorite example. I got to keep my partner's far shoulder on the mat. I can do that with an underhook. I can do that with the lapel post. I can do that with the cross face, and go practice this with your partner and see how you can work through it. It's unresisted, so it's like static drilling, quote unquote, but the intent is something different. The intent is to draw the athlete's intention and attention in a way that I think is going to be productive. So to bring that back to powerlifting and to the classification system, I think you can do any of this. You can use whatever method you want. I think part of really good coaching is being creative, right? It's just having a clear understanding of what is the intent? What am I trying to achieve with this practice task? And given that, what modalities make sense? Using 70% in the squat could be a totally reasonable thing to do if what you say is, my goal is we're like looking for quad and glute hypertrophy. So we're going to do some really hard sets with like between 70 and 80%.
Sure.
If your goal is to improve quote unquote technique in a way that transfers to maximal lifts on the platform, then maybe we say, well, we should probably do something that it requires us to use loads that are relevantly heavy for that technique. I'm doing scare quotes for you not watching the video, right? So you can use any kind of methods you want. I think the important thing is just understanding what is the intent, what are you trying to achieve with the practice task, and what methods actually make sense. And then the other thing I'll say is when I'm designing a game, the number one thing that I'm thinking about is representativeness. So is the practice task representative in meaningful ways of what the athlete is going to be required to do in the sport? And that it's not that it needs to always be perfectly representative. If all we ever did was perfectly representative training, all my athletes would ever do is free sparring from the feet, and all your athletes would ever do is heavy singles. So the point is not you have to be perfectly representative all the time. It's more like there's a minimum level of representativeness that we always want to meet. And from the ecological approach, where that, and again, this is one of those things that's like, it's going to apply in the peaking stuff for powerlifting, I think. It applied like the idea of technique, and it's why the 60 to 70% technique work doesn't really make sense. The representativeness has to do with information in the environment. So there's this concept of task simplification versus task decomposition. Task decomposition is when you actually remove the task from the relevant context and information variables in such a way that the task is decomposed and the athlete no longer has to work with those information variables. So an example of this might be, if we're talking about soccer, dribbling a soccer ball through cones. Yes, you're working on dribbling a soccer ball, but when you actually dribble a soccer ball, you're going to be doing it in the face of defending players who are trying to act on you. And so rather than decomposing the task, we might simplify the task by saying, okay, your job is to dribble past this defender. And the rules for the defender are they're going to keep their hands behind their back so that they can't cover as large a space. And they're only allowed to move left, right. They can't turn to face you. They can't cut an angle. They're just like moving laterally. And then we can gradually, I'm just making this up. I don't know anything about soccer, but we're just gradually, we can say like, okay, now the defender can turn to face you. Now there's going to be two defenders or whatever, right? So simplification versus decomposition. And for me, I'm always trying to simplify the task as much as I need to, or as much as I need to is determined by the student, right? What's the level of complexity they can handle? So to give a jiu-jitsu example that, again, may or may not make sense to people, but I'll try. If we're in like we're playing a pinning game where the top player's job, starting in side control, and the top player's job is to hold the bottom player flat on the mat. And the bottom player's job is to either get up or put their legs back in front of the top player. If I want to make the task simpler for the bottom player, I will make the task less representative by doing something like telling the top player, hey, you're not allowed to do what we call switching your base. You have to stay on two knees and keep your chest on your partner's chest. You can't like switch the position of your hips and chest relative to them. That is going to lower the representativeness, but it's also going to lower the complexity. That's task simplification, where the student on bottom has to they really have to engage with real information variables that they're going to experience in the sport environment, but we're simplifying the task. We're making it less complex so that a newer learner can have more success. As opposed to just saying, oh, we're just going to like go through the steps with no resistance. Now we've decomposed the task. The most important information variables, which are the resistance your partner's giving you, that's where all the most important information comes from, are gone. In the powerlifting context, what I would think that means is something like, if your goal is to improve technique, or like, let's call it execution at maximal loads, then the relevant variable, the relevant information is going to, and I'm doing information like sense data, it's all associated with that heavy load. So if that's what you want to improve, you need to train in a way that you use that load. If that's not what you're trying to do right now, that's okay. There are good reasons to use lighter weights, right? So when you squat hard sets of like 8 to 12, you do like quote unquote hypertrophy training, you are reducing the representativeness, but we're going for a different thing. It's action capacity training, so it doesn't matter as much. But even then, I think we would all agree, and pretty much all powerlifting coaches would agree, on average, doing hard sets of 10 in the squat is a better option for your powerlifting development than hard sets of 10 in a leg press with an equivalent weight. Doesn't mean you don't do them. I'm just saying it's going to have better transfer. Why is it going to have better transfer? Well, it's going to have better transfer, at least in part, in my view, because you're closer to the information variables that you're going to be, I keep wanting to say grappling with, but I realize it sounds too pun-like. Those information variables are more similar to the ones that you're going to be dealing with when you actually do a competition squat.
Yeah. I think that's a good example of decomposition versus simplification as well. Like you could simplify it in certain ways by changing where you have the load or having a box, different things, but changing the task entirely. Now we're doing leg extensions. Yeah, I see where you're removing all the environmental information from that. Well, and then like you wouldn't necessarily expect that to improve somebody's technique. It's why, say you take a bodybuilder who's very well developed from a muscular standpoint, but just hasn't practiced the skill in any meaningful way. They're not very strong at first, and maybe they make up that ground quickly to develop the skill, but that skill does have to be developed.
Was a competition between a bodybuilder, CrossFitter, weightlifter, and powerlifter, and they all tried each other's modalities. And it was interesting, especially for the bodybuilder and the weightlifter, how they struggled with the deadlift because of how non-specific the way they executed those movements were in moving maximum amount of weight. Mm-hmm. The weightlifter cleaned it, and if you know the difference between clean and deadlift, there is a very distinct way in which you want to align your levers. And comparatively to her strength, that expression wasn't there because she hadn't practiced it. And the bodybuilder was very well built and had a very good size to muscle ratio, but the way she executed the deadlift was not in a manner that is skill dependent of 1 rep max.
Which is interesting because the deadlift is usually the one that's disparaged for being the least technical.
I mean, all of powerlifting is pretty untechnical, guys.
Sure, by comparison to almost anything.
Sorry, I had to get my digs in.
Yeah, well.
And it just reminds the conversation regarding degrees of change you make away from the competition lift. Like we would use maybe lower loads to work early rate force development in the deadlift, and we might want to increase speed off the floor using a deficit deadlift for the same reason. How often you would see low RPE deficit deadlifts, now we are getting to the point that we might be very far away from specificity unless there was a very good reason. And there's still always some people who are outliers that will respond to the training.
For sure.
But typical, I guess, ideal execution of training, there are certain things that seem to be aligned with success in programming, in skill acquisition, that are non-ignorable.
Yeah. I suspect those parameters are bolder, clearer in something like powerlifting. So in my head, I think about 3 broad categories of sports. There's subjective sports, which is I just mean there's a subjective judging component. So think here gymnastics, where obviously there are standards, but the standards they're subjective but not arbitrary. And then there's game sports, jiu-jitsu, basketball, whatever. And then there's performance sports, powerlifting, track and field, where it's just how far can you throw thing? How much pounds can you lift? How quick can you do the 100? And I suspect that the parameters for training are going to tend to be bolder when it's performance sport, because I think that performance sports just tend to be simpler, relatively speaking. I mean, there's just fewer variables in a 100-meter sprint or in a 1RM squat or in a snatch than there are in a game of basketball or a jiu-jitsu match or whatever. And so I think that you can do whatever, you can make it all work as long as I think your intent and your method are aligned. I do think that when it comes to something like powerlifting, the sort of like raw physiological stuff that underlies it plays a bigger role. And that's also true for action capacity training for jiu-jitsu, but it's just that like probably a bigger part of the training for jiu-jitsu is going to be skill development training as compared to action capacity training, as when you compare it to a relatively lower skill, lower complexity thing like running the 100 or powerlifting, where it's like, well, it's not that the skill doesn't matter, it's just that there is less to it. And so you're probably going to have longer, bigger phases of just like, I got to build up the raw physiological stuff. I have to build up the action capacity. That's not to say that the skill is not important, that you can't refine your skill over time, but like, you're probably going to spend comparatively little time on skill between something like powerlifting relative to jiu-jitsu than you do on action capacity, and vice versa.
Yeah. I mean, relative to something like jiu-jitsu, where that's really
most of the thing.
I do think that it's underappreciated, I guess, is like as I've developed my training picture over the years and worked with different clients. One thing I've been talking about more lately is this idea of training effects coming in 3 categories, and again with the categories, right? But we can think of training effects like skill effects, structural effects, structural adaptations, and metabolic adaptations. I'm finding the most results when I bias the training more toward skill, I guess. When I first started playing around with that idea, I started looking at training that was fairly evenly distributed between those 3 foci, or even biased a little bit toward skill and structure, with metabolism being comparatively less important for powerlifting. That's a whole other conversation. But even then, biasing even more toward skill and skill development has been more effective.
Yeah.
Like I think, doing your accessories and stuff like that, building your action capacity definitely has its place and is important for long-term development. But the skill training does that too. There's more training effect there than one might anticipate, especially if you're thinking of skill as purely technique.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other things that I would file under the rubric of skill that's not just this low resolution technique, how am I moving my body through space.
Yeah, I think that even the concept of technique is a little incoherent. So when I think about, I don't think about technique, I think about skill. And so I think you're totally right. There's more to it than technique. I don't know how helpful a concept technique is, period.
Yeah.
I do think, to your point, so you mentioned that like this quote unquote skill training develops action capacity. Not like it doesn't. And that's true in jiu-jitsu too. I think that probably in powerlifting, the skill training does more of the action. It makes has a bigger impact on action capacity than the skill training in jiu-jitsu does. At least as regards, I am still of the opinion that the most important physical attribute for grappling is strength. There's people who would disagree with me on that. Those people, I would say, explain weight classes. And so you're just not going to develop your strength very efficiently with grappling. You will develop some special strength, but if you want to get really strong, you need distinct action capacity training. You need to go do your squats and your rows and whatever. For powerlifting, your skill training involves eliciting adaptations that are like structural adaptations. When you are making meaningful structural adaptations, not to muscle size probably, but of other kinds, when you do sets of 1 to 3 in the competition squat, right? Tendon stiffness and muscle pennation angle and stuff like that. So I think that's part of it too, is that the skill training for a sport like powerlifting and the skill training for a sport like the 100-meter sprint, or an event like the 100-meter sprint, has a more of a meaningful impact on action capacity, even for comparatively advanced athletes. Where in jiu-jitsu, when you're brand new, then your strength really doesn't matter very much. But as you get more advanced, those things happen to matter a lot more. Whereas with training for powerlifting, a lot of the training you're doing, even for limit strength or skill for very elite athletes, is going to have really meaningful impacts on your action capacity. I think that's less true for a sport like jiu-jitsu, which also would impact the way that we design training.
so nobody's hips or knees explode. But as a powerlifter, as a powerlifter, I am not accustomed to sitting in one spot for this long. So.
You're accustomed to sitting in one spot for this long, broken up by intermittent periods of doing one rep.
Yeah, get up.
Yeah.
Get up. Sit up. Stand up. Like
Right.
Carry some duffel bags and then load them.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, man. Well, appreciate your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Mel, appreciate your time as well. Always fun to talk about these different ideas. And thanks everybody for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.